Hola y bienvenidos al podcast Un gato en tierra de perros, vuestra referencia para la política estadounidense, la cultura y mucho más. Hello, I'm Joe McGaha. Thank you, friends, for being with me for another episode of Un Gato en Tierra de Perros. This is an interesting one. We have a panel on to discuss the multiple conflicts going on across the world. An esteemed group of guests, I would say. We'll start off with Kelley Vlahos from the Quincy Institute. Welcome, Kelley.
Thanks, Joe. Glad to be back.
Glad to have you for sure. I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about everything that's going on. We also have with us ex-intelligence member Brooks Crenshaw. Welcome, Brooks.
Hey, Joe. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, for sure. Yeah. There's so much to talk about. And last but not least, we have an expert in crypto and also a veteran of fighting in Syria, Mr. Amir Taaki. Welcome, Amir.
Thanks. Nice to be with you guys.
Same here. Fun. Same here. Now, I'm sure I figured I'd start with you because of the information that's been coming out of Syria lately. I'm sure you've seen all the different atrocity videos. Was that something, have you seen those and what's your take on it? And was that something that you could have predicted while you were there?
I mean, the guy that's in charge of Syria, he was literally the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria. The ISIS, Islamic State, and HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they're both branches of Al-Qaeda in Syria that basically split over a turf war. So he was their leader for many years and, shared the same ideology and so on. He basically saw an opportunity to make an alliance with Israel and Turkey to overthrow the Assad government and has been put in power, but he still has that same Islamist ideology. If you see the constitution they've drafted now, it's the same hegemonic ideology that led to the Syrian civil war. So, it's also interesting that Alawites, as a religion, they're not really, they have all these, they believe in reincarnation. They're kind of like, are they really Muslims? They have a lot of very secret beliefs. They've always been like this kind of marginalized community. The Sunni ethnic group is like a lot bigger. So, it was something, there's like an interesting text that was written a while back, and it was kind of saying like how if there would be a regime change in Syria, the Alawites as a group would have to be eliminated. It's just like something that would have to happen. They would have to be targeted.
Yeah, and I don't see a lot of, I honestly don't watch a lot of mainstream media anymore. I watch some, but I haven't seen. The only place that I've seen these videos is on X or on, I don't think I've even seen them on TikTok, but I've seen videos of them forcing men to crawl to their own execution, barking like dogs, things like that. Really brutal stuff, but not new in some ways, things that we've seen before, or at least we've heard about before. But yeah, very, very dark stuff. And I think because it's not being covered across the board, maybe there's not going to be as much outrage because partly because the powers that be probably want us focusing on other things. So I don't know, but yeah, I don't know that I'm wondering where it'll go from here. If it'll escalate to a full on, if this will end up being contributing to our issues with Iran and other parts of the Middle East, I'm sure.
Iran's lost big time. They've literally been for years. Like if you go to Iran, a lot of Iranians, they're like, oh, why are we fighting America? Why are we fighting Israel? Why are we supporting Palestinians? All of the money in the country, all of the wealth from the oil is going to support, this conflict, which many Iranians, they don't feel a connection to. But for Iran, it was, strategically, the whole kind of conflict over Jerusalem, like you see it with America as well, evangelicals. There's a lot of big support amongst that segment in the US for Israel, which is a country very far away. And it's not a rational thing. It's not like, oh, there is some interest here. There's some other kind of spiritual significance that people attach to it. And it's kind of similar for Iran, except if you look at how Iran has always waged war in the Middle East since ancient times. If you look at the geography of Iran, it's basically a fortress, like it like lies on the Zagros Mountains. It's very difficult to occupy. The same way Afghanistan, it's a country that's, Afghanistan's like, where they say where empires go to die. Every time an empire goes to occupy Afghanistan, it ends up, bleeding, a lot of losses, ends up leaving. So the thing with the geography of Iran, though, is while it makes it difficult for armies to invade, also makes it difficult for Iran to maintain standing armies outside of that. So typically, how they've waged war, it has been through proxies. And the modern regime, they use these network of Shia proxies, which is a remnant from the Persian Empire in the past, where Islam conquered Iran, it unified the whole Middle East. There was an age of economic boom, but then Iranian influence created this branch of Islam, the Shia branch, which is today like how they maintain this influence or network. And there's all these kind of Levantine peoples and branches like the Druze, the Alawites, which are also kind of connected to the Shia, but also very divergent. They're almost like Gnostic form or paganistic forms of Islam. So Iran was investing a huge amount into that network at the expense of its domestic development. And it's basically, with the collapse of Syria, lost all of that. Meanwhile, its infrastructure is crumbling. So they're in a very bad place right now. And, America now has signaled a willingness to go after, the Houthis in Yemen. So it's kind of like Iran's losing, it's gradually being cut off from this network. It doesn't seem like Iran's going in a good place. However, Iran's entire economy is a resistance economy. Like after the revolution in '79, when they had the war with Saddam, which was a proxy war, supported by the West to weaken Iran, they invested a lot into sovereign development. And we see every so often these protests that happen periodically, these like color revolution type protests in Iran. None of them succeed because a lot of the people in Iran that oppose the regime, they're young people. They don't have a particularly strong ideology except some vague form of liberalism. They're all very liberal. They're all really like America. They're like, oh, we want to be like America. And the people that they're up against are literally crazy Islamists, like people that are like, willing to cut off their own head for the Ayatollah. And this is kind of, we're seeing a similar thing happening now with Russia, where, the EU is ratcheting up this like war talk. And, everyone's like, yeah, let's go to war. But, are Europeans really ready for what that's going to take? Because Russia, like what people don't realize in the West is that, those people, Russians, they're actually nationalists. They actually are willing to die, for their country. Like they're like crazy. they literally get prisoners, male prisoners, and they rape them. People comfortable Europeans, accustomed to like high standard of living, welfare. They're ready to be, dragged into a war economy. Potentially dragged into being deployed in Ukraine. So we're seeing this breakup of power, this like multipolarization. It's happening, and the US is like shifting, I think, to China. It's like Europe's not really that important. Destabilization in Syria as well. I think this war is not over. I think basically it's going. There's like more fronts are going to open up. There's Israel in the south. Israel's going to try and leverage the Druze. The Kurds which is the side that I fought on and the side that I support. The Kurds, they're surrounded by hostile forces that basically want to eliminate them. The Turks, the Arabs, etc., the Iranians, and but their struggle actually in the 70s when it was started alongside the Palestinian, like the early Palestinian resistance, the PLO, etc. So they've had like a very historic connection to that, and for a long time they've kind of been, loyal, at least paying lip service to that. And Israel was like for a long time trying to, there's a lot of support in Israel for like Kurds. It depends. It might not be like real support, on behalf of the government, but at least amongst a lot of Israelis, there's like a lot of people who are like, oh, the Kurds, they're like the early Zionist pioneers, etc. So there's been a kind of lot of overtures by Israel that until now are kind of rebuked by Kurds, especially since in the north of Syria, in that area that they govern, it's actually majority Arab. So, it's not just Arab, there's Christians, there's many people, but at least as a whole, Syrians generally, they're against Israel. Even if, they're against Assad, they've been against Israel. And from the beginning, you had the Syrian opposition fighting Assad. And the Kurds, they supported the Syrian opposition in the beginning. Originally in like the very early phase, like 2011 or 2012, when it first started, they were orienting themselves towards that. And, the Syrian opposition was like, no, Syria is a unified country. We will not allow, they were just asking for autonomy, recognition, of their rights to language, identity, etc., which they denied. So then the Kurds went, to Assad and said, oh, will you at least grant us right? And Assad was like, no, Syria is a unified country. So neither side was willing to budge on this issue. And it's this, Syria is also multi-ethnic. It has Druze, it has Alawites, it has Christians, it has many different groups. But the Sunni world as a whole, and it's also related to the culture, which is kind of very tribal, has feudalistic elements. Has a very strict literalist interpretation of Islam. The Sunni ideology. They're very hegemonic, and that's why a lot of the Ba'ath regimes, if you look at the actual flag of the Syrian, and I'm not joking, this is the name of the party that was in power, is the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. They literally have a swastika as their logo. I don't know how I could share it here, but it's literally.
I think we'd probably be deplatformed if we shared that flag, but you never know. Thank you so much. I every time I talk to you, I get a history lesson, and also I just familiarize myself that much more. Brooks, do you agree that the fronts are just going to change in this conflict, but it's going to continue?
Oh, conflict in the Middle East continue. I think
Yeah.
that's a reasonable assessment. To piggyback on a couple of concepts that you brought up, it has been my experience in Iraq and Afghanistan and following other conflicts that you mentioned the atypical beliefs of the leadership and like how puzzling it was that they didn't seem to be like rank and file mainstream Islam in terms of their beliefs. It's been my experience that revolutionary movements, and you could call the revolution for a unified caliphate and its many branches that are going to have infighting. Whether you're talking about that through the religion of Islam or the neo-Marxist types that have their own kind of religion of critical theory, like the leadership is usually not that bought into the orthodoxy and the liturgy. That's how they mobilize their forces from the bottom to the middle. But at the top, they're usually gangsters. They're usually power players, power brokers. And I think it serves them not to drink the Kool-Aid too much because it allows them to be agile morally and strategically. So I think that's one thing that you mentioned that I would add to. In terms of Syria, I mean, we learned a couple of lessons, and I've certainly learned it the hard way, that introducing change to stable regions in the Middle East have bad odds. You know, whether you're talking about the Shah or you're talking about Saddam, I thought in my naivete that I was going to go over there and liberate Iraq. I was going to liberate these people, and we were going to hand them a thumb drive with Jeffersonian republicanism, and they were going to adopt it, and they were going to be free. And it turns out you can't do that because you can't hand a pre-Magna Carta society your culture. Like this sequence has to be realized organically, and the Middle East has an operating system that is incompatible in some regards with American democratic representative republic. They tend to use democracy as a streetcar to find the next dictator. And that's an unfortunate fact. And with that knowledge, it's often best not to poke at stability in the region. And that would be my takeaway.
I agree. Yeah, like like we said in the episode prior, we always seem to want to get rid of these bad men, but we never plan ahead as to who's going to replace them, which is a terrible idea because it's usually somebody worse. Kelley, what are your thoughts on Ukraine and what Amir said? He said so many things I could just draw off of it to go in many directions, but I kind of Amir, when you said what you said about Europeans fighting in Russia, and Kelley, I'd love to hear what you think about this. It made me think of the song "Safe European Home" by the Clash, because nobody wants to go fight in a jungle somewhere when you have a nice safe European home. And besides which, it looks like even though maybe the European Union has the money to do this on their own, which I don't think they do, they still don't have the military forces. Are you thinking, and are you optimistic about peace?
Well, I mean, I argue with the premise, not Amir's premise, but the premise overall in Europe right now, that if Russia isn't stopped, that Putin will rampage over the borders into NATO countries, and that Europe has to gird up, it has to arm up for a broader war against Russia. And I think all indications before, during, and after the invasion point to very specific goals that Putin has with Ukraine, and he is not interested in going to war with NATO countries. But there is this threat inflation that Europe and the United States have engaged in that would require billions more of defense dollars and an infusion of those dollars into a military industrial complex, both here and in Europe, that is unnecessary. And we know that there are multiple forces at work, special interests that would like to see that engaged. But I don't think that Europe could build up its defense industrial base in time for such a war, if it were even a possibility. And second of all, I'm not sure that Europe is really interested in fighting a war with Russia. They would love to see us fight a war with Russia, meaning the United States, but I don't think that they're both equipped, and they don't have the will. And I don't think the United States has the will either. They love to build up their military industrial complex for war, but they don't really want to go to war. And I think this has been a dangerous game, because it's pushed at the red lines of Russia continuously since 2022. And we've been lucky so far that Putin hasn't gone for the bait, considering that he is a nuclear armed power, we're a nuclear armed power, and things could get really out of hand. I think, and this is probably not a popular opinion on this call, but I do think that Trump is going in the right direction and pushing for a ceasefire and just pushing at that logjam to get peace at the bargaining table, because it is obvious that it's not going to happen on the battlefield. And the longer this war is engaged on the battlefield, the more destroyed Ukraine will be. Because I do agree with Amir. I think Russia has the spirit and the will to take this all the way. And I don't think that Europe or the United States wants to see what that would ultimately look like.
Yes, for sure. For sure. Now, this is a question for all of you that just popped into my mind as well, thinking about this, because I think I told you before, I was born in Spain and went to high school there. And when I was living there, that was right when they were discussing bringing Spain into NATO, rather. And I lived in basically a socialist neighborhood. So we had signs, not signs, spray paint, graffiti everywhere that said, no to NATO, Yankees go home, and that kind of thing. And so I kind of kept my head down and tried to hope nobody noticed the American living in their neighborhood. But now there's talk of the U.S. pulling out of NATO. NATO, I mean, of course, was created to confront or to push against the USSR, which hasn't existed since the early 90s. So a lot of people question why it's still even going. If the U.S. does end up pulling out of NATO, and this is for any of you, do you think NATO will go on? My heart will go on. NATO will go on.
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. I don't think that we're any way near close to getting out of NATO. I mean, the United States. I think you have a number of strains of thought on NATO in this country. You have the very pro-NATO, which is the predominant thinking in Washington, and I think in the country overall, that it is a good organization. It is a positive alliance with Europe and the members. But I do also think that there is a realist movement, which I actually agree with. It has nothing to do with getting out of NATO. I know there are some people in that realist movement who would like to see a gradual extrication from it. I'm more of the opinion that NATO had been founded in the spirit of the Cold War. It had specific goals to keep the Soviet Union at bay, and it did a really good job at doing that. But now it's gotten to the point where it's this massive bureaucracy in Brussels that's keeping a lot of people working, and that's fine for those elites in Europe and the United States. But what it's doing is engaging in mission creep in other places, and it engaged in that expansionary strategy against Russia. And, I'm one of those people that say that did lead to what we're seeing in Ukraine today. So I'm all for NATO. I am for a reduced role of the United States in NATO. And I think that the Trump administration is more in that vein, where they want to see NATO members take more responsibility for their own defense. But I'm also very wary of just continuing to find missions for NATO, including China, and this somehow this add-on of China being part of this mission, democracy building as part of this mission, which is also kind of crept in on their website. So I'm a wary observer. I have a good friend, Sumatra Mitra, who you might want to have on the show sometime, who's written about a dormant NATO, a NATO that is all the capabilities and mechanisms are there, but it doesn't spring into action until it's necessary. It doesn't just live on and look for things and monsters to destroy. I can't speak for his paper. I wouldn't want to, because he's much smarter than I am. But I do think that there are a lot of ways of thinking about it that aren't just an either or.
Yes, yeah. And
I would agree with Kelley on that. The thing to remember is Trump as a negotiator. Most politicians negotiate based on last year's budget. Trump starts at 0, right? And so the opening round of a negotiation is, well, how about there's no NATO because we're not in it, right? So like properly gauging Trump's negotiating tactics, I think Kelley's right in that what Trump is looking for is a reduction in our especially funding role in NATO, and that our European partners pay a little more. She mentioned that we were pushing things in 2022. I would say we started pushing in the 90s, with not an inch to the east. And, the same types of policies that crept out of the neocon movement, to include modern monetary theory and, this expansion of NATO into the self-licking ice cream cone that it's become. I think that is the cause. I think we could get a peace deal relatively for not a lot of cost. I think Putin would be satisfied with a formalization of the already inhabited, areas of Crimea and the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk in particular, and probably a lifetime ban or a full-time ban on Ukraine ever joining NATO, which 20 years ago would have been an unthinkable red line. So, kind of resetting those expectations, I think Trump and Rubio could probably get that deal relatively, I don't want to say easily, but more easily than the news media would have you believe with regard to ramping up the saber rattling. It would require a series of good exit strategy with regard to reduction of sanctions as the Russians, withdraw from current territories, etc. But I think there's a deal to be made. Yeah,
I agree. And I think, well, it's interesting, Trump is about to put these tariffs in place. I think in April, a lot of the tariffs are coming up. And I just heard on the news that a representative of China said, basically, if you want to go to war with us, whether it's a literal war or an economic war, we're prepared to, which is not not something any of us wants to hear, I don't think. Is there a high risk of China actually engaging with us in some way militarily? Or, I mean, economically, they've already been taking different actions, including actions in Africa, but militarily, we haven't really engaged with them, and I wonder if we will. And that's for any of you as well. Yeah.
Well, so we think of war as front lines and tanks and artillery. I would submit that, in the modern era, economic warfare and psychological warfare are already in play, and that China has been quite effective in those media, those channels of war fighting. I think China has been emboldened by the Ukrainian development with regard to Taiwan, but I don't know where that goes. I think if it does go, it creates a large problem. I did some consulting work for some of the warfighting labs for DoD with regard to littoral Chinese operating technologies, and so they are certainly ramping up and adapting to that new potential threat. But you know, we will see on that. That said, I think I know we're talking about China. I want to zoom out a little bit. I think what we're seeing in the U.S. is what I would you know, we fight proxy wars, but I actually think that what we're doing right now is fighting an inter-administrative proxy war with ourselves. I think we have, you know, when you see the meme of the Hamas rockets coming in, you know, and the Iron Dome coming up to meet the missiles or the rockets, and the meme says, my tax dollars paid for this, my tax dollars also paid for this. And I always assumed that that was a result of, you know, just extravagant government overreach and creep, such that we were just indiscriminately spending. And then maybe there's some rival programs within different agencies that are, you know, that have different interests. But I tend to think that what we're seeing both with the Houthis in Iran, and the Democrats meeting with Zelensky to try to, you know, affect that peace deal, I think we're seeing an interpolitical, I wouldn't call it a civil war, but it's a series of proxy wars to weaken Trump. And so that seems to be playing out as well. And I think China is going to definitely have a role in that.
Yeah, yeah. I think, well, it sounds like from the information that's coming out, and Doge is still going and looking into things, but it sounds like U.S. aid took an active role in regime change in various countries as well, which is in a way not surprising, but you know, it's kind of kind of like the Wizard of Oz when they pull back the curtain and he says, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. You know, it's like you can't unsee it once you see it. And I think that a lot of people are still keeping their blinders on because they don't want to know how much evil we've been involved in around the world, and how much damage we've done, even with the best intentions. You know, even for those of us who possibly were thinking we were saving the world or saving these people, you know, you can think you're saving somebody's house by burning it down to get rid of the infestation of some kind or another, but you're not saving anything. You're destroying something, which is really crazy. Amir, since you've been quiet for a while, I had a question for you basically about BRICS, if you have any opinions on it. It seems like people are pulling out of it. India no longer seems to be interested. And that's another way that they were kind of going around us in the economic war. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the process of de-dollarization has been something that's ongoing for a long time because, you know, basically the whole world is realizing that this like post Bretton Woods arrangement, you know, it doesn't really offer much for them. But there isn't really any really good alternative, because you mentioned China. I kind of see China as a very controlled, like kind of closed economy, where they're very focused. They have, you see a lot of these videos on the internet where they have very impressive looking infrastructure projects, and you know that's because, you know, there's a lot of government, you know, industrial mobilization behind that. They're weaker in other areas, like other areas of computer technology, which the US actually has a lead on now. I just heard that the US is actually going to start a Manhattan project for artificial intelligence. So actually they want to consolidate all of the resources in the US, which US has like apparently a 9-month lead on China. And I think that's why kind of now they're abandoning Europe, because they're like, there's like now this like intense competition, you know, over the Pacific and this trade war with China, and they're kind of thinking like, oh, you know, getting involved in Russia, it's not really worth it. I've heard this idea where people are saying, oh, you know, Russia, they're just going to stop at like, you know, East Ukraine. I'm actually not sure, you know, that's Russia's intent. I think Russia, they've kind of dug in for a long time because they're playing a war of attrition. You know, because they basically got like an unlimited, you know, manpower, you know, that they can draw on through their allies, through their large territory. They're also a technological state as well. So they're just kind of like, you know, bleeding Ukrainians until they kind of, but I can't, if you look at that geography, which, you know, Russia, you know, is very much of the geopolitical rather than the international relations school of thought. Like Dugin, Alexander Dugin is one of the, he's like, his books are actually read in like the Russian academies. He's one of their chief theorists. And he actually made this like map, which you can find from a few years ago. If you search geopolitical map Russia. But what's interesting is if you look at the Eastern Plains, which is this large flatland area that goes from basically Berlin, and it's like a triangle shape where the Carpathian mountain range is this mountain range that goes, you know, to the west of Ukraine, and you know, extends through several countries like Austria and etc., and you know, it's Romania and so on, and but then like north of that mountain range, going basically the whole of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics is flat land. And always in Russia's history, how they were invaded was through that funnel. So I feel like, you know, as Kelley was saying, that, you know, there was a provocation with the missile shield by NATO. So Russia probably felt very vulnerable, you know, that they're encroaching on East Ukraine. So I kind of get the idea that they're kind of going all in to capture that mountain range, because it has a very strategic overlooking point over all of Europe, in kind of Europe's heartland. And obviously Europeans, they feel very threatened by that, especially, you know, like if I'm in Europe, I'm in Switzerland, so I interact with a lot of Europeans. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of Ukrainians who, you know, they're very much like, oh, we need to defend Europe from Russia, but also a lot of the Eastern Europeans as well. They're very traumatized by, you know, their experience with Russia in the past. And you know what you guys said about NATO. You know, yes, there's like a rational way to look at it, but a lot of the people who are in power in Europe, you know, they're like really old people that they should be in care homes, but they're in the halls of power, and they talk like, you know, they believe in nothing. They just believe in, they're like nihilists. They believe in power, and their entire like political positioning now is, we're not Trump, you know, and so they're living in this neoliberal fantasy of, you know, like a international rules-based order, when that order itself is crumbling. So, you know, maybe, you know, it's impossible for Europe to go to war with Russia because, Europe has, 7% of the world's population, but it has over 50% of the world's social spending. And that is a consequence after World War II, where the United States, the Bretton Woods-based system, as a protectorate of the Western world, of NATO, Europe was able to use that money to fund the social program. And Europeans, like in the same way, people in the Soviet Union, they grew up around the Soviet system. They couldn't imagine living in a different kind of system. Europeans have grown up in that system. They're very accustomed to this, system that's, the state, the social welfare. So, they now announced that they're bringing in a CBDC in October this year, the EU, and the European Union has had a long process over many years of centralizing their financial infrastructure more and more. And the whole point of having a diversified network of banks is the banks issue credit in the local communities, and that helps develop society as a whole. But when you centralize your financial infrastructure into few large banks, then it stops people being able to get access to that credit. It stops small businesses, local producers, etc. And it instead favors, financial speculators who print money, and they use it to, play zero-sum games, extract wealth out of society. And this is kind of like what has happened to the Western economy as a whole, where, in the final phase of the Roman Rome, as it started to decline, the currency was debased. Which is what we've seen. It was a overextended military. A lot of these factors that we're seeing repeat today, which is not a mistake, because a lot of the Western political system is actually modeled off of the Roman system. All the words we use, republic, dictator, etc., they come from Rome. And it's a very interesting case study where, we're seeing a lot of those patterns play out again today. And so they're talking about the CBDC, and China is actually being a pioneer in a lot of that stuff with the social credit scoring system, where they to explain to your audience, the social credit scoring is that you get a social credit score if you do good behaviors. So if you're seen helping an old lady, or you do something that's good, you get a higher social ranking. If, for example, you told a lie, or you hung out with bad people, you get a lower social credit score, and then that might stop you being able to buy, food in a supermarket, or to buy a train ticket, or you have to pay more rent, etc. And they use that to incentivize or disincentivize people's behavior. And when we brought China into the IMF in the 90s, there was this perception that, China would become liberal. China would become more like us. But actually the reverse happened. Europeans saw that and they were like, oh, that's a really good idea. Social credit scoring, we should do that. And part of this is, also the CBDCs is a response to cryptocurrency, which cryptocurrency, it's a technology that fundamentally changes the logic of violence in the sense that and this is like, to answer your question, what you were saying about this emergent Chinese style economy, which by extension the BRICS is like connected with that network of Russia, China, and they're trying to make their own SWIFT system. They're trying to de-dollarize, but it's very much a controlled system, like a guided system. China, how they were able to develop, industrialize really quickly was through export-led growth, where it was guided strategic plan. China thinks on these like really large, 10, 20, 50-year time
100,
scale.
yeah, exactly.
100 years. It's crazy. You read, they publish these reports, and they discuss, like I remember I think it was 5-10 years ago, I was like, oh, the Chinese government, they're just like materialist Marxists. And then I was reading some of their ideology, and they were talking about, Confucianism, and they were talking about a lot of very interesting ideas. And I was like, oh, we can't just discount, China as, these materialist Marxists. They're actually aware of, concepts like narrative and desacralization and, what's happening in the West. And you see it in Russia, where, they're bringing back orthodoxy, and, they're like going, oh, Russia is a Russian society. It's not just about, a single racial group of Russians, but it's like it's like an empire of many different, nations that exist, many different religions. They all form part of the Russian tradition and are satellites as well. And this kind of integralism is what we feel is missing from the West. And it's why now people are like, people are going, you've got people trying to recover some sense of pride, and it's being done in the form of nationalism, where for a long time people were told, oh, you're a baddie, you know, everything about your legacy is bad. And now, you know, people have felt lost about that. And they're like, okay, well, you know, what can we recover from our legacy that, you know, can help that, you know, that spirit, so that, you know, we can, so Western society can like recover and progress forwards. And this is like the crisis at the heart, where there's been a social moral degradation in the society. And, you know, what we're seeing in Europe is that, there is a big silent majority in Europe who's against the globalism and the neoliberalism, but it's not the majority that's in power currently, especially the EU, which in some ways is using the Ukrainian context as a casus belli in order to establish a unified, EU army.
hegemony, right? Yeah.
They're talking about it now, and a lot of and there is also, I've also seen like a lot of people now, you know, they're you know, there's a lot of memetics around Hitler, like people going, oh, Hitler, and it's almost like, you know, Hitler, like Carl Jung said that Hitler is like the manifestation of this European figure of Wotan or Odin, which is like he's almost like a trickster figure who, you know, every so often he comes along and, you know, he causes chaos and war breaks out, and there's a sense of like movement upwards and, you know, triumphant expansionism. But then at some point Odin leaves, and he leaves everyone in the ship. And it's like now this kind of attitude in Europe where people are going, we don't need Americans, we have European power. And, you know, Europeans have been accustomed to, you know, a life of social welfare. Like, as Brooks was saying, is very correct, which is war is not just a front line. People, you know, when people imagine that war is like, you're in a war and there's bullets flying everywhere, it's not like that. It's actually mostly pretty normal. There's a front line, you go to the front line. But apart from that, you know, it's like just normal third world country, you know, or normal life. Everything goes on as normal. But a big part of war is you know, the logistics, you know, this, and how it changes society. And war is really shitty because, you know, let's talk about the front line. You're on the front line, and most of the time it's boring. You're there for months and months, and you're drinking tea and you're smoking cigarettes, and you're like, why am I here? What am I doing here?
Yeah.
You know,
Hurry up and wait is what they call it in the military, I believe. Hurry up and wait, because it's the same with if you're a police officer or whatever. Most of the time you're sitting there waiting for something to happen. So when it does happen, you know, you get a charge of adrenaline, and then it takes place very quickly, and then you collect your debt and move on to the next thing. But yeah, I agree. I was thinking, there's so many, you touch on so many different things. My mind is going all over the place. But I, in terms of the digital, it seems there's a big push. I mean, there's been a push in the United States against digital currency, against cryptocurrency. And part of that, I think, is, like you said, because they want to be able to control how our money gets transferred, and also tax us and that kind of thing. But they always paint it in the United States as criminals. Criminals use Bitcoin, you know, drug dealers and human traffickers, and, you know,
Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, same, you know, Silk Road, same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm wondering, it seems like now at least Trump is more friendly towards Bitcoin, and there are even states that are looking into having Bitcoin reserves. I think, I can't remember if they've actually done it yet, but they're talking about it, I think, in some states, which ultimately, are you guys hopeful for Bitcoin or for crypto in general, or do you think that it's still kind of on a cliff where it could go either way?
I would say so long as it stays democratized. Like, the worst outcome for a cryptocurrency is the centralized, you know, what Amir was referring to. Like, the whole point of crypto is that it's not government. It's not backed by a gun, in the sense that it is free and open. and that creates an opportunity in markets that we've never had before. So yeah, I see that as a positive. There's still, and Amir, we might talk offline. I'm still a little confused on the value proposition with regard to where the value comes from with regard to gold-backed, currency in historical context, versus a fiat currency. But yeah, I see it as a positive, and I'm hoping that it's here to stay.
Yeah, I've had some friends, because I've recently started buying little bits of crypto here and there, and my friends say, "Well, it's gambling." I say, "Well, yeah, it is, but so is the stock market."
Stock market, yeah.
And then they'll say, "Well, yeah, but it's not backed by anything." And I'll say, "Well, yeah, kind of like the US dollar." You know, the US dollar is backed by the Fed, but and I wonder if the Fed is eventually going to go away as well, because it looks like there's a movement to push towards that, because there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not the Fed is a positive influence on our economy or a negative one. And in terms of war, which we're all focused on, I think in general, I had a friend recently tell me, "Well, wars are great for economies. That's how we got out of the Great Depression was World War II." I'm like, "What are you talking about? If we're all dead, then there is no economy for one thing, but also it's very difficult to do business."
Broken window fallacy. Yeah. The broken window fallacy in the Bastiat sense, or the Henry Hazlitt sense, that I'm not going to tell that story again, but if you're not sure what that is, you should look it up as a listener. The broken window fallacy is precisely what's at play there.
Yeah, like send people to war, but the elites aren't fighting war. It's good for them to make money. That's time oldest story in history.
Yeah. Old men talk, young men die. What is it that old men, young men kill other young men they don't know, so that old men that know their enemies can advance, something like that.
Yeah, Walter Kern said something recently about how, because he grew up, he's just a few years older than me, and he watched people during the Vietnam era, and he said mostly it was rich people sending poor people off to die, and so a poor young guy would leave and fight and come back sad and without a foot, and have to move forward, and that's kind of the way it's been. But I think that at this point, a lot more people are against war and are over war as a form of domination, although there's always the risk. It's always a mixture of economic sanctions, which are also a form of warfare. I mean, it's kind of, do you want to die by being shot in the head, or do you want to die by starving to death? I mean, neither one is a positive option. Kelley, what do you think our outlook is, at least in the next few years, towards peace, at least relative peace? I know it's a ridiculous question, but I had to ask it.
Well, I mean, we talked a little bit about Ukraine, and I'm cautiously hopeful that the Trump administration is going in the right direction on that, but I'm not so sure about Israel. And I can't tell you how much it has pained me over the last 2 years to watch my tax dollars going to the destruction of the Gaza Strip. Whatever you can say about that particular conflict, however you feel about it, it's been going on for decades. The fact is that no one has explained to me in real comprehensive or convincing terms why it is in U.S. interest to pour billions of dollars into weapons to destroy Gaza and to kill civilians. And I am concerned as an American that whatever credibility we had following left after the Iraq and Afghanistan debacle, why we would put the rest of that credibility in the toilet as world leaders, as supposed moral leaders of the world, by eschewing international law, by eschewing all of our own principles and values when it comes to starving a population, killing women and children. Again, this has nothing to do with the conflict between Hamas and Israel. but the protection of civilians, which we dedicated a lot of energy and moral authority to after World War II, after what happened in Dresden, after what happened in Japan. And as a Gen Xer, as somebody who had grown up believing that we had limits, that we fought for what was good and what was right, and as however naive that sounds, there was still a shred of that belief. And I saw that all evaporate in the last 2 years. And I have watched as the Trump administration has vacillated back and forth from saying he wants to clear out Palestinians and drive them into other places. I just put up a story a couple of days ago about U.S. officials saying they want to put Palestinians in Sudan and Somalia, two of the most dangerous, poverty-stricken places on earth. And so that Trump could build a Riviera on the Mediterranean. And then he says, no, they can stay. Then he says, no, they can come back. Then he says, no, they have to leave. And I have no idea what he's doing. I don't know if this is some distraction. I don't know if he's just bluffing so that the Arab nations will come in and start taking over some of the responsibility for security and reconstruction there. And then we won't have to. I don't know if he's doing Netanyahu's bidding by wanting to ethnically cleanse the entire Gaza Strip and annex the West Bank. I have no idea. I would like to think that Trump is his own man and that he's not doing the bidding of another country, that he might be like more of a Washingtonian and in the George Washington state of mind where he doesn't believe in entangling alliances, that this is about the United States and its interests. But I don't know. And I'm one of the people who actually keeps an open mind on Trump and his foreign policy. I'm not a never Trumper, but that half of the equation I have less optimism for.
Can I take a stab at this, Joe?
Sure. Yeah.
Because I sympathize, Kelley, with your position. The first thing I would return back to Trump's negotiation strategy, and I would say that the American Riviera in Gaza is his version of zero in the opening salvo of negotiations. I think one of the critical elements of this conflict is rooted in laws of international conflict. You know, as an American soldier, I had to wear a uniform and not hide amongst the civilian populace in order to receive proper treatment from an enemy, which I wasn't going to get if I got captured anyway. But, you know, from an incentive structure standpoint, we have these laws in place so that military forces will act accordingly with regard to civilian populations. Coleman Hughes said this, I think, very succinctly, and I think he said it better than I will now. But in a conflict in which your enemies are actively using civilians as human shields and hospitals as infrastructure, if you allow that tactic to work, you have incentivized it internationally. And so I think that is one of the crux of this conflict. Because in a use of force continuum sense, if we allow that tactic to be the dominant tactic for the next generation, we're going to get more of it. And so I think that's where the real rub is. I sympathize because it's an awful situation, and I agree with Kelley with regard to that.
I agree.
Yeah.
But I do take offense, not to anything that you said. I take offense when American voices like Ted Cruz, for example, and even RFK Jr. at one point have acted as though that our troops have been in similar situations and even have acted less morally than the Israeli military. They have said, oh, well, our troops did this. We've been guilty of the same things. This is all about war and the fog of war and whatnot. I covered, you know, I wasn't there, so I covered from Washington in a very cushy perch, I guess, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as a young writer, maybe not too young. and the wars in the battles in Fallujah, for example. I did not see the kind of behavior that I'm seeing by the IDF in Gaza. And you could say, well, they're hiding among the population. Well, let's consider the situation. We evacuated Fallujah, or we helped to evacuate most of the civilians before we started bombing the shit out of them, which they can't. These poor people can't get out of Gaza. So there has to be a consideration of different tactics. And everything you just said presupposes that Israel is always telling the truth about everything, like the Hamas in the hospitals, the Hamas in the population. It also denies the fact that Israel has been using Palestinians as human shields, like having them go in front of them when they go into buildings. And they admitted that just the other day. So I feel like we have to keep an open mind and not be so deferent to everything that Israel says on the ground there. And I certainly take take umbrage with the idea that they have been protecting civilians from the beginning, because that's the narrative they've been pushing. And well, I do believe that our own soldiers, the Americans, have had rules of engagement where and sometimes they're criticized because they do look out for civilians.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with Hamas, if I'm asked to believe one or the other, I tend toward Israel. I reserve the right to criticize Israel. I'm not taking money from AIPAC, for example. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But again, it's the nature and the terrain of Gaza makes things complicated in that you have a captive civilian population,
right?
That is an asset to Hamas, in that sense. We do have examples of, Israel sending in, hit teams into the hospitals rather than leveling the hospital. Those are at least examples of restraint that if Israel was doing what its critics say across the board, that would be an exception or atypical to the narrative. But yeah, this is a complicated and terrible dynamic. My concern is the tactics that we're incentivizing. That's job one internationally. Beyond the Israel-Gaza conflict, this is the global consequences.
Yeah.
Well, interesting.
Go ahead.
Just to cap that, because I know this is an endless conversation, but interestingly, there are conservative groups now, like the Heritage Foundation, that are now advocating to end the aid to Israel, and which, their argument is that it will take some of the restraints off of Israel to do what it's got to do without U.S. involvement, meddling, whatever you want to call it. I do think that there are arguments on both the left and the right now to extricate from that relationship in which we're giving them $4 billion a year and in military, and because they have built up quite a mighty military industrial complex. And so, like, I know this is an argument that is so fraught, but I would like to talk more, maybe not on this show, but like in general, about the U.S. interest in continuing this particular relationship and the policies that are born out of that relationship, because I just think they've gotten a bit toxic.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I blame Kissinger.
Say it again.
I blame Henry Kissinger.
Yes. I wanted to get a clean clip of that. I agree. Kissinger was very good at kind of manipulating situations to destroy populations.
He's the biggest piece of shit. They could have settled all of that conflict, but he deliberately amplified it because he wanted to make everyone weak. So he just unleashed demons that existed under the surface. Absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
But just to be very quick and succinct, all of these problems originate from the nation state, which the nation state was, as Brooks was saying earlier, the whole in the West, the development of like, liberal values had an entire process, and together with the emergence of the nation state, which, the emergence of the nation state was a successive process of unification, of elimination of local identities. 80 years ago in southern France, 40% of the population spoke Occitan. That was a language that was systematically eliminated to create a French unified state. And the Middle East is not like that. The Middle East is very ethnically diverse, tribal place with many different groups. They've been living there side by side for millenniums. It's also the origin of the world's major religions and philosophies of human civilization. There is something about that land as a meeting place, where very important ideas or concepts have emerged from. But it's only in the last 100 years that we've had this huge problem with religious fundamentalism, with ethnic cleansing, with war, all of these issues, and it really stems from the nation state. Because the only way that you can have a nation state in the Middle East is to have a dictator, and is to homogenize, and what you end up with is in a place that is very ethnically diverse, with all the nations overlapping with each other, Christians, Kurds, Arabs in the same lands, different nations but overlapping. And when there's a nation state, everybody competes to have absolute power. And the one who has absolute power, the way to enforce that power is to eliminate the difference. The problem in Israel is that there is an Arab population there. It's different to South Africa, where the Africa, it was a minority white population that relied on the labor of the majority black population. In Israel, the Arab population, they don't rely on that, and in fact it causes them security issues, etc. So that's why it's not going in a good way, and it's the political model that is used. It just does not fit the mentality of people in the Middle East, and you see it with Arabs in Dubai. They're like, oh, capitalism, that's cool, and but they're still like a feudal society. And so you get literally a slave state. They've literally got slaves, because that's like the logic of the society, but with capitalism. So that's like the root problem with the Middle East right now.
Well, what you just said about capitalism is in the Middle East is the same problem of trying to introduce a more sophisticated Jeffersonian republic. It doesn't take, and so you devolve into slavery because that's the default in the region. I would push back that the nation state is the problem. I mean, history is full of barbarism and toil, and our current era is an exception to that. I see the nation state as an attempt at stability, because stability is required for human flourishing and innovation. And you have to have some organizational structure that allows for that, and the nation state has been the solution. I'm not saying that it's the end all be all in all of human history to include centuries ahead, but it has its pros.
Yeah, the danger, of course, is suppressing dissent, which is kind of its purpose as well. I mean, in Spain, Franco basically did that, where he got rid of the, because people think of Spain and they think, oh, Spanish, that's the culture, that's the language. No, there's 5 different native languages. There's 5 different cultures, but he made it illegal to speak the different languages. And he also purposely, with the draft, he would send a soldier from one part of the country to another. And part of that was that he was hoping that he would meet a nice young girl from that part of the country and marry her. And ultimately, we would have what they called España una grande y libre, which means, Spain, one, big and free. Well, a couple of other things, maybe not so much. But yeah, same with Gaddafi. And Saddam Hussein, who really kept the tribes, kept everybody from infighting, because basically, and to be honest, in Spain, there was very little crime during the Franquismo, because you weren't afraid of local thugs, you were afraid of the cops, so.
we did a modified strategy of that in Iraq, because like the question is, how do you ensure that the police and the military police the civilian populace and don't turn on you? Well, you take all the Shia and you have them police the Sunni areas, and you take all the Sunnis and have them police the Shia areas, because they're natural rivals, and you essentially divide and conquer. Like, this is divide and conquer, man. It's the same.
It's like how we got rid of the Native Americans.
Right.
We sided with one tribe to fight another tribe because they were traditional enemies, and then ultimately, yeah. And I mean, that stuff carries on even in the United States today. I was at a powwow years ago at the Morongo Reservation, and I was wearing a Leonard Peltier t-shirt, and he said, "Who's that?" And I said, "Well, he's an Oglala Sioux who's been imprisoned by the FBI." And he said, "Well, I don't care about the Sioux. I'm Morongo." And I was like, okay, so there's no unity. You guys are still, this is why you're where you are, I think, my friend, these things happen.
But like in Switzerland, it's like a confederation, and there's independent nations. They have a unified, centralized military, and they have a unified foreign policy, which is essential for any country or government to have.
What we're supposed to be, like what the U.S. is supposed to
what
be.
the U.S. is supposed to be.
Yeah.
But the problem is also what Syria should be. Syria should be, Sunni area, Alawite, Druze, Kurd, under a unified, government,
Yep.
highly localized, giving rights and autonomy to people, because essentially, like trying to that's what caused the war in Syria. Is like, demanding that everyone's unified into an Arab republic, Arabizing everyone, and it's like these borders in the Middle East, they're not natural. When you look at them, there's lines on the map. They cut through entire nations, and it just creates more conflict, more war. And the only way that those powers, those hegemonic powers, can stay in power is to have a very oppressive, private police intelligence apparatus to suppress any kind of dissent. And the Middle East, because of that hegemonic ideology, has become very regressive. It hasn't been able to develop technology. So, for example, like the Arabs, they're like literally always blaming everyone else for their own failure. They're like, we're being oppressed by the West, blah, blah. It's like, well, Gaddafi, there's a famous video of him where he's in the Arab Union, and he was right. He's there, and he's just exhausted because he's been arguing with them, and he just gives up. He's like, oh, us Arabs are our own worst enemy. It's because they infight and backstab each other. Like as you said, they're like, their elites are completely corrupt. They're just interested in money. They have no ideology, and this is ultimately what power does. And this is what I think maybe the US is moving towards. Is there is an argument that they're getting rid of the bureaucracy. They're downsizing the government, but they want to solidify power in a smaller elite that has a lot more executive. There's a very interesting interview with Steve Bannon, where he says that he basically got Trump into power in 2016 because he recognized two groups that were uncatered for. One was the kind of Tea Party people, and the other was like conservative Latinos who, they're Catholic. And a lot of the other Republicans, they were kind of playing this game, of power with the Democrats, and they kind of, well, oh no, you're wrong, Bannon. But then he kind of leveraged that to get Trump in power, but he got marginalized. But he basically says that these kind of, they're called tech right people that are coming into power in the US now. They're actually progressives who they saw an opportunity to get into power, but they have like this transhumanist tech agenda, and they're not so much interested, because Bannon calls himself a nationalist populist, and he's all about like fostering the local human resource in the US. But it seems like maybe that's not what is the plan for the US, which is to become this economic power which develops technologically.
Well, two things that you touched on that I want to back. What you said about the unnatural borders in the Middle East, like that's absolutely right. Early on in the Iraq War, I was out in Western Anbar in the desert, and we had these smugglers that were crossing the borders, and we get intelligence, and we knew the rat lines that were being used, and we started to interdict them, and what we realized was, no, these people have been trading across this path for 1,000 years, and they don't even recognize that straight line border that they're crossing. Like, so they're not smugglers; they're traders that are. So we had to get smart on the mindset of the locals with regard to that. And we interacted with a lot. Of Bedouins in the.
I was going to say the Bedouins in Israel.
Oh man,
lines all the time.
It's like you showed up from a time. It's like you arrived in a time machine, because minus the odd plastic litter, like the water bottle or the odd Toyota Hilux truck, like you might as well be in the first century. Like it's the same, man.
Yeah.
The other thing is, the direction of the U.S. Scale is an issue, and we were founded as a federalist, like 50s, or well, not 50 at the time, but like we have become what is supposed to be 50 unique experiments. And those experiments function properly because failure creates misery. And when you have 50 experiments, you isolate the misery instead of federalizing it and spreading it all over the country. The issue of scale is, both in population and in economic output, each American state has a nation that is comparable. I believe Kentucky, where I am, is I forget which. Each state has a comparable economic output and population doppelganger in a European or Asian country. At that scale, it's, especially with regard to economic systems and experimentation, that's a better scale to mess with. So like when people are like, well, in Norway, they do this and we should do this in America. It's like, why don't you try it in Maine and see how that works at that scale?
Because like in El Salvador is having so much success with cleaning up their crime problem and also kind of fixing their economy. But they're the tiniest country in Latin America.
Let's see governors do that, right? Because each state has its own unique economic clusters and culture, and letting that experiment thrive. I believe a return to the vision of 18 enumerated powers for the federal government and a lot more autonomy at the lower scales is the best solution, but I don't know if we'll get there.
Yeah, I think ultimately a lot of the conflicts that are going on around the world and going on internally within our country are about freedom and about individual freedom and freedom of the populace to think on their own, to speak on their own. There's been this push towards censorship. There's been this push towards basically criminalizing wrong thought, wrong think. I mean, Amir, I know in the UK, people are going to jail for tweets or for things they post on Facebook. Yeah, it's crazy.
It makes me angry a little bit. But because it's like people are just being like abused, like people are really suffering a lot, and this is the thing. Like it's like been really shocking for me to observe, like how liberals have just become like
illiberal. They become illiberal.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're like. I'm talking with them and I'm going like, do you realize that going to war with Ukraine, it's not, they're like, yeah, we just doubled the amount of money. I'm like, no, you don't just double the amount of money. It changes everything. Like literally like the entire society, like the social welfare, which was a consequence after World War II, when when over 50%, 60% of the population was under 65. Now that's less than a third, and like old people are regularly living to 100. You know, so it's like the social system was created for a very different time. You know, Europe is already struggling economically. Like, there's no new technology being developed here. It's a very undynamic, non-entrepreneurial continent. And people are like, oh yeah, we just double click the money button. And it's like, no, like literally the social welfare state in Europe will have to become a warfare state. You have to construct a military industrial complex. You know, to cover the labor shortages, they're going to have to increase immigration. That's going to create more social tension inside of the countries. You know, more social issues.
Well, you're talking about
wars is going to create more immigration, like in Syria, in Ukraine, etc. In terms of the US as well, I kind of, you know, it's one thing to say, because the US, it's literally an island in the middle of the ocean. Like nobody will ever attack the US. You know, if you gave everyone in the US, you know, like little militias, you gave them rockets, you know, you create a highly localized system, everybody in the US would be very wealthy. You'd be very well off. You know, they might not eat avocados from, you know, Latin America or whatever, but they will eat well. You know, everybody will have a very good lifestyle. But I get the impression that that's not what the US want to create, and instead, you know, there is a sense of going into this, you know, competition with China and this gamble on the future, and it's like kind of it's a very risky gamble, where, you know, you're locked in a competition. You've already, you know, sunk cost. You already put so much in. You know, now there's the AI thing. They're talking about a Manhattan project for AI. That's a huge deal. You know, they're saying, they're literally all the different AI companies in the US, they're saying they want to consolidate them into one giant project. And they're saying that at the end of this, you know, there will be artificial general intelligence. And the first country that gets that will accelerate into other technical fields. You know, and, you know, maybe the end result of all of this is that the US becomes the first country to mine asteroids, and the first country to do that will become extremely wealthy. But it's a big risk, you know, and it's a different strategy to the one of, you know, investing in your country, in your nation, restoring that social fabric, you know. So it's kind of like, you know, they're turning up the dial rather than turning it down. And it's kind of like almost like MAGA was like just a tool to get into power. You know, there's like a meme where it's like, it's got like a MAGA guy and he has like a fell for it again award, you know, so.
Well, yeah, there are so many mixed messages that are going on here, because, yeah, we do. One of the clear problems in the United States is that we no longer make anything. We no longer produce anything. All our factories have been outsourced to third world countries or to other countries, not necessarily third world. Some are in.
What will happen, you know, in our lifetime when they're talking about putting chips in people's brain? Are you going to get the chip? Like, well, you know, are you going to put your kids at a disadvantage,
right,
or and not get it, or will you get it and it's a proprietary chip? You have to have a subscription. You know, it's some company, they don't share the code or the hardware. You know, these are going to be real questions that people have to contend with.
We're already there with aging. We're already at that place with aging, because the peptides and the advanced technology that is available now to the first adopters, who are the wealthy, they pay for the research cost and the startup cost every time, and then it gets rather democratized. But we're in a place where the lifespan and the youth, I mean, look at what is some of these Hollywood stars that you could see them decline over the last 10, 15 years, and suddenly, man, they are back, right? Demi Moore is back.
The other
And
one is eugenics. Like
Yeah.
the elite are already doing that. And
Yeah.
I say to people, I'm like, we should democratize eugenics.
Mhm.
And people are like, whoa, steady there.
You don't want the poor people to live forever.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like,
Not the hoi polloi.
Right.
how are you going to contend with transhumanism? Maybe one thing will be that we have to engage in genetic engineering and eugenics. Create superhumans with 250 IQ. We maybe are going into like a neo Dark Ages era where there will the system will be pledging fealty to like a lord who has like all these people, and if you're under the service of a lord, your destiny is tied to him. I also think another big factor is that before we had this situation where it was the West versus the rest of the world in terms of wealth disparity, I think that's going to be a lot more distributed. But within nations themselves, there will be a lot more inequality between the.
There already is, yeah. I mean, they say that the expanse between the 1% and the 99% is greater than ever, and
But at the same time, extreme poverty worldwide has dropped,
diminished, yeah.
So those are the guardrails, right? Like we're in between those.
But I mean, that of course doesn't focus on countries that are still basically living like they were 1,000 years ago. Countries in Africa, which we don't really focus on, we don't really talk about a lot. Even the conflicts, I've mentioned this before. There are so many massacres and slaughters that have happened in Africa, but people don't have cell phones there, and the videos don't end up on TikTok.
Slavery.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I understand people that are protesting Gaza, even though I don't agree with everything that they're doing, because they're kind of getting a little nuts. And then there's kind of a whole movement that seems to be going towards eco-terrorism as well. I think that somebody's paying for the bombing of the Tesla, the firebombing of the Tesla showrooms and that kind of thing. And I think that more of that is going to continue because, and there was a push for that not long ago, around the time of the pandemic and the BLM, the whole punch a Nazi thing. It was okay. Violence was okay if it was towards the right people. And that scares the hell out of me because, I mean, I know I've a friend of mine who we're not close anymore, but she was like all for punching a Nazi, but she also believed that words were violence, which is another equation. And I said, well, if you punch a Nazi, he's going to punch you back, and you're a tiny little thing, and most Nazis are not. So I don't think it's a good idea to punch a Nazi,
From an incentive structure standpoint, you have to then punch people who call people Nazis that aren't.
Exactly. Yeah. And everybody gets accused of being a Nazi or a racist or a homophobe. Not everybody, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because I went to fight with the Kurds and the YPG because I really sympathized with their political program for the Middle East. It has a lot of libertarian elements to it. And when I came back to England after the war, I was under house arrest, being investigated for terrorism because I fought against ISIS, believe it or not. That's how cucked and bad England is. But anyway, I was in that situation, and I started talking, questioning a lot of the narratives, like immigration, like what was happening, and there was a vicious attack by the left against me, who cancelled me, saying I'm a fascist. Like, can you believe it? It was just so extreme. Yeah. And like, you're a fucking fascist. I was like, whoa! I just fought in a war, to support these people's freedom, and you're attacking. And it was all just driven by resentment and jealousy. And the thing is, they did that to everyone. They were, you're a fucking fascist, punch a Nazi. And then people were like, I guess I'm a fascist. Let's check out what fascism has to offer then.
Exactly.
And it's just wild to me because the Zelensky Vance thing the other day that happened. I saw that video, and then I was talking with Europeans and I was talking with Americans, and it was like they saw two different videos.
Realities,
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, how's that possible? Like two different realities. Like the Americans were like, oh yeah, Vance, he really showed that guy. And the Europeans were like, oh, Zelensky really embarrassed them. I was like, did you guys see the same video? It's crazy. Like different people are inhabiting different realities. There's like different regimes of truth. And it's increasingly going into this where, people are not afraid to use power to enforce that. And this is the thing with the stuff that's happening with Trump is, it's one thing firing the government, but I don't think that they can really change things unless they start using power,
Yeah.
Well, Congress, without Congress, this is all imperial presidency, and it gets undone with the next opposing administration. So without the authority of Congress, I don't think this lasts.
Yeah, and Congress is a mess now. They're constantly infighting and virtue signaling. It's kind of like, I don't know if you remember in the 80s, they sort of decided to clean up NYPD because they were known for being so corrupt. And there's a great documentary, the 7-5, I believe it's called, or the 7-4, awesome about that, about the corruption within the police department, which I was in New York traveling during the 80s and I saw it firsthand, but I kind of felt more comfortable with it. It's kind of like the way people used to feel more comfortable in Vegas when the mob ran it, because it was like, well, you kind of knew where you stood. But of course
Saddam.
Of course they cleaned up they brought in police officers from all over the country and got rid of all these corrupt police officers, but corruption slowly seeps back in and it all kind of starts over again. And I think that that's one thing that's going to happen. None of these changes are going to be permanent, and they can very easily be turned around within one administration. So I want to thank you guys so much. I wish I could go on forever with this. In fact, I want to do it again. I appreciate having people with great minds. It makes my job a whole lot easier because I can just listen for the most part. Let's go through where they can find each of you. Brooks, where can folks find you on the internet? And you have a book out or coming out as well, correct?
No book. I'm currently on X at Crenshaw Actual. My Substack is called The Dataless Thread, and you can find me there. And I have a YouTube channel, The Dataless Thread.
Awesome. Kelley, where can everybody find you?
Sure. I am the editor of Responsible Statecraft. So I have the humble responsibility of editing a lot of authors and writers on various subjects in foreign policy, and I'd love for each of you to check it out. So I can be found there. I also do some writing, so I also have a byline there. Also, I've been writing frequently for the American Conservative, for which I've been associated with for almost 20 years now. And and our parent organization is the Quincy Institute, which also has a lot of smart people talking about these foreign policy issues. So Quincy Institute as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Amir, where can folks find you on the internet or anywhere?
I have a project, DarkFi. So, a good entry point is the Telegram. I also have a Twitter account. You can just search my name and you'll find it.
Yeah, perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. And I definitely want to do this again sometime soon. There's so much going on in the world, and I feel like we just touched on each topic, but there's yes, exactly. But I definitely want to do this again. And thank you to all our listeners. And until next time.
Thank you, Kelley and Brooks as well. You're lovely people. It's so nice and fun to talk with you.
Yeah, it's great meeting you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really enjoyed the good faith exploration, guys. It's great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you guys later. We'll have a group and we'll chat there as well.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Can you include me on any emails with these guys? Because it would be great to maybe extend the offer to have you write for Responsible Statecraft or be subject matter experts for some of our reporters that are working on these issues. You guys are amazing.
For sure, for sure. And to all our listeners, thank you so much.